Hi, everyone. I am Barbara from the Engine Room. For those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit that works to strengthen the fight for social justice. We support civil society organizations in using technology and data in strategic, effective, and responsible ways. I work as a community engagement manager at the Engine Room, and I'm joined today by Kito and Teresa, who are my colleagues, and Malika, who is representing No Tech for Tyrants. Do you all want to introduce yourselves? Kiko, Malika, and Teresa.
Yeah, I can go. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited that you're here with us today. I'm Kita. I'm the research coordinator at the Engine Room and worked with Barbara on the project that we're going to be telling you a bit more about very shortly. Hand over to Teresa.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Teresa. I work as a research manager at the Engine Room, and where I didn't work specifically on this research that Barbara and Kito will be talking about. I'll be talking about other research that we have done. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to Malika.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. My name is Malika, and in my day job, I work with a migration justice charity, but today I'm here in my capacity with No Tech for Tyrants, which is a student-led tech and migration justice organization.
Cool, that's great. Thank you so much, Malika and Teresa, for joining us. For those in the room with us, I know that originally we had other speakers listed, but they both had some personal or emergencies and couldn't join us today. Our agenda for today is talking about our recent research on how to build bridges across digital rights and social justice groups. We find that through our work at the Engine Room, social movements need to use technology and data more and more. Using tech and data is no longer a luxury for a lot of social justice movements. It has become a true necessity. And we've seen through our work that using technology and data in strategic ways can increase impact, but it can also bring new risks. So today we'll hear from our speakers, Malika and Teresa, about how they're working on the intersections of social justice and technology. We're also going to share findings from our recent research on this topic, and we'll also have some time for a bit of interaction and listening to your experiences and having an open discussion from you all as well. So before we get in, I want to make space for Teresa and Malika to introduce themselves if you want to tell us a bit more about your work, and that would be great to hear. Yeah.
I can jump in now then. So yeah, at the Engine Room, we try to do research kind of, looking at what civil society is doing and in what ways we can better support civil society use of tech and data. And the most recent research that I have been personally coordinating, also doing it with Kito, has to do with digital ID systems and digital ID schemes across the world, but specifically, so yeah, backtracking a little bit. In 2020, we launched a pretty comprehensive report on lived experiences of marginalized communities with digital ID systems across 5 contexts. And what that showed is that a lot of what is not being talked about when you're trying to advance these types of systems is exactly that, the lived experiences of communities that are not really being prioritized in design. And then moving from that, we try to understand then what a digital ID system that is grounded in justice, has justice, a social justice as its grounding point, what it could look like, what it could be, And we wanted to understand how organized civil society, right? How organized civil society efforts could impact, if they could in fact impact design of the systems, and in what ways. So we looked specifically at the cases of Jamaica, Indonesia, Uganda, and oh my God, I forgot Pakistan, and trying to assess how CSOs and activists and organizers were grappling with the effects, and what were their initiatives to, mitigate some of the harms done by the advancement of these systems. So I'm going to stop there and hand it to Malika.
Oh my goodness, that sounds incredible. I will be reaching out to learn more about that after this session. So as I mentioned before, I'm a member of No Tech for Tyrants, and we are a student-centered UK-based organization that works to sever the links between higher education, violent tech companies, and the hostile immigration environment, which for folks not based in the UK is a set of governmental policies in the UK that is essentially designed to make life terrible for migrants, and turns all sorts of public services essentially into home office reporting authorities. And so in a nutshell, No Tech for Tyrants does a combination of coordinating student-led research, which highlights the role of higher education institutions in enabling these kinds of violent tech companies, as well as doing some organizing with other students, thinking about oftentimes students in like computer science departments as future tech workers, and thinking about how we can mobilize labor power in that sense, as well as a strong arm of teaching, workshop building, and participatory work to kind of change the conversation around what's expected from students and higher education related to the tech industry. We also make pretty excellent memes, if I say so myself. So there's that.
This sounds great. Thank you both, Teresa and Malika, for joining us and being willing to share more about your work. We found in the engine room that more and more social justice communities need to be resourced to handle those challenges that come with technology, with data, and their knowledge of data and digital rights and how those issues impact their communities need to be incorporated into how we think about data and into how we think about technology and digital rights. And what we think and what we believe is that if we want to see more intersectional approaches emerge in the conversations around data and digital rights, we need social justice activists and organizations to be a part of these discussions. But that isn't always the case, like both of you know. We've been finding that DDR groups, data and digital rights groups and social justice groups can be quite distant from each other. And we would love to just jump in the conversation. I'm going to hand it over to Quito to get us started. And thank you everyone again for joining us. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your work.
Thanks, Barbara. So we're just here to try and learn a bit more about the research and share. We want to give both Teresa and Malika space to share with you guys a bit about what they've been seeing at the intersection of tech and social justice. So to kick it off, I want to know a bit more about what you've been observing. So Teresa, obviously you manage the engine room's research on digital identity, in particular looking at civil society advocacy around digital ID. Could you tell us a bit more about how you saw the intersection of digital rights organizations, the social justice organizations in the advocacy around digital ID systems?
Absolutely. So in a nutshell, we found a lot of things, right? In a nutshell, one of the main, key findings of this research is just understanding that there's often a divergence between what the two groups want, and what should be, the advocacy targets, which of course can, makes them working together a lot more difficult. So usually, and we really try to focus specifically on this research report on social justice actors, just because they are usually not the ones that are prioritized when talking about digital ID. It's often, digital rights and data and data rights groups that have both the international support and usually know how to employ the language that is legible both to funders and to the international community when talking about these issues. That is not usually the case with social justice actors. So we kind of shift and focus on specifically these grassroots actors that are working directly with marginalized communities to see how they were seeing the deployment of these systems, and how they were dealing and grappling with the effects. So what we found was essentially that social justice and these community-based groups, they focused a lot more on issues of access, exclusion, and discrimination. And they are frequently campaigning for the government to make it easier to register or even let them assist in registration. And where does that come from? How this the rollout of digital ID systems is happening across the world, and especially in the global south. It's awfully they mention, or they say that it's not necessarily mandatory at first, but they attach that to service delivery, right? So they attach that to access to welfare aid. They attach that to healthcare. So it ends up being, mandatory, just because if you don't get it, if you don't register for this new ID scheme, or if you're not registered in the database, you don't access healthcare, right? So a lot of the social justice groups are focused then on getting people to access the system in the first place, even though the system is not perfect, even though the system is problematic at its core. Whereas we find that, digital rights and that DDR, as we're using the acronym here, they are more focused on the technical and design aspects of digital ID, and they are concerned with issues of security and privacy. And of course, this is super important, right? Talking about, privacy and, biometric data collection. Where is this data, who is going to have access to this data? Those are all fundamental and very important discussions to be had. But it's kind of hard to convince, people that are representing and trying to organize marginalized communities to care sometimes about privacy security, when there are very real, material existential needs that are attached to access to digital ID. Besides that, as I mentioned, DDR groups are often more, they're funded by larger international organizations. They're more legible in the space, and their advocacy can be very much influenced by kind of this outside perspective. Even using the language digital ID, is something that grassroots groups do not necessarily use. And often you can see that sometimes even like local, digital rights and data rights groups, they can disagree with international organizations. So what we found, for instance, in the example of Jamaica, was that there was kind of a disagreement there between local groups and international groups when talking specifically about biometric data collection. And then to conclude, there clearly needs to be more overlap between the two, because those two, are very important, two sets, and shouldn't even be considered separately, but there are two sets of work that and approaches that are very important and have utility to both. And there's a lot of room then, I feel, for growth and for collaboration to happen. So I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Teresa. Malika, I'm curious, in your work with No Tech for Tyrants, like seeking to dismantle violent technology and the hostile immigration environment, like you mentioned earlier, really curious as to how you guys approach bridging tech and social justice through your campaigns and research.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question really gets at the point that Teresa ended with around I guess questioning that fundamental distinction that's being made at the beginning between data and digital rights work and social justice, right? So the kind of intertwined research and campaigning that we seek to do is the kind that struggles to imagine data and digital rights work that is not inherently grounded in questions of social justice. Like the kind of research we want to do is not objective view from nowhere academic research, but rather research that thinks about data and technology as lenses through which to attack these broader questions of power. So for example, our campaigns are research informed, but our research is targeted through our politics. For example, right now we're working on looking at researching different ways that police abuse technology, using research on technology as a mode of looking at broader issues with policing in society. And so kind of just trying to negate that division between social justice and data and digital rights work in the first place has always been quite crucial, and trying to subvert I think the lack of movement solidarity that can sometimes be couched in that hype of international legibility that data and digital rights work can sometimes be granted. There is often this sort of expectation that, say, like a grassroots organization working on a non-tech specific issue should immediately understand the way that a certain question of tech policy, for example, should impact their work and is completely relevant to it, and therefore should adapt what it is that they're doing to, meet the normative tech goals that, the data experts are saying should be the case. But I think maybe the better imperative there is for people working on data and digital rights work to force ourselves to be creative and subvert that burden of adaptation, right? Like, if we're technologists, we should be thinking about how our struggle is the struggle of the movements we're trying to support, and how we adapt our questions to support the things that other movements are trying to achieve.
Yeah, from what you're both saying, I think it's clear there's there's a huge amount of space and opportunity and need for collaboration. And I think one of the big questions for us in our research are what are the challenges to this kind of collaboration? In particular, one of our main findings was that the data and digital rights actors taking social justice into account and collaborating with the communities who are disproportionately affected, like those that you both outlined, by data and tech issues, has emerged as a priority, particularly during the pandemic. And social justice actors have increasingly themselves felt a need to more deeply understand data and digital rights work. So with those kinds of observations in mind, Teresa, my question for you in relation to this is about the fact that we've seen digital identity very much being pushed, particularly in the global south, by big international organizations like the UN and the World Bank, in contexts where many who are registered with the systems don't fully understand them. What are some of the main challenges that you've seen social justice organizations facing related to tech in the context of digital identity?
I mean, one of the main things that we kind of found, and that is also reflected in the recommendations that we make to funders and to organizations working with this team, is the fact that there is a huge information asymmetry in the first place. So, and there's also an issue of sequencing. Usually these actors, they get pulled in or kind of forced into advocate in this space after the systems have been, deployed, implementing, and they are just like dealing with the harmful impacts there. So advocacy in the sense ends up being very reactive, since they are not consulted on the implementation of the digital ID system in the first place. They're not included in the design phase, in the development phase. So another issue there is also that usually digital ID systems and identification systems broadly, they're thought through a national security framework and lens, and they're not. So governments are usually not very forthcoming and use this way of security to prevent questions or challenges. So you face that information asymmetry there from implementers. And there's also, previous, lack of knowledge in relation to, the technical aspects of what the system is and how they will impact, the lives of communities. So in the sense, what we see is that these actors are really forced to confront many challenges at once. And the issues related to access and exclusion often feel and seem more pressing and immediate. And then especially having limited resources, which is the case with most organizations. Also, there is still speaking about lack of knowledge, but there's a specific lack of knowledge and research on digital ID systems to draw from, specifically done for the global South. I would say that Aadhaar in India is the exception because there's a lot that is documented there. But without contextual knowledge, it can be very challenging to gain in-depth technical understanding of the data and tech aspects of digital ID. So yeah.
I mean, I think it's clear that there's a lot of challenges and a lot of desire to learn more, and I think a need to meet that desire in a more legible and direct manner than is happening right now. I'm curious, Malika, in your work, what some of the main hurdles groups like students, unpaid activists, migrants' rights groups that you maybe have collaborated with and so on, what kinds of challenges they face when trying to address data and tech issues, and what are maybe some of the inspiring approaches or initiatives, if you can think of any, that you've seen used to try to tackle those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think I broadly agree that when we're often working in very resource limited capacities and there is no like shortage of terrible, like immediate pressing issues that people are facing, it can sometimes be hard to allocate the resources and time to a structural, not even a structural, but sometimes what seems like a more abstract element of like a challenge, right? Saying, okay, well, we should all divest from this government app that we hate is not really going to help someone who needs the app so that they can access like the services they need to navigate, their immigration application. And so trying to navigate those complexities in a way that doesn't expect our end goals to necessarily be our immediate goals, but that don't betray the values and the long-term goals of a movement. That's always a challenge. I think when we're working with organizing students, for example, one of the issues can often be that abstraction. That's a challenge we face a lot, right? Kito, I know you and I have talked to so many people who, when we say, oh, you maybe like want to think about the broader elements of power that are related to this company and this company that you might think about working for or doing research with, it is so much the going line that people are told that their work is completely separate from something that has ethical implications. Their work is non-political, and of course you and I imagine many of the people in this Zoom call don't believe that and don't agree with that, but that is often a step that I think sometimes it's easy to forget is a step that a lot of people still need to take and make. And also doing that in a way that's respectful of people's varying circumstances without, I guess, subverting it to the question at the individual level.
Definitely. I think that it's, the tough thing is that the context that people who are working to try to bridge this kind of disconnect that they're working in, it's really hard, right? It's resource constrained, it's time constrained. And the biggest, I think, kind of question that we're left with in this research project is what can we do to change this context? One big part of our findings in the research is that though collaborations between data and digital rights actors and social justice actors have unfortunately been quite limited, there is a shared appetite, demonstrable shared appetite for more cross-sector engagement. So my big question, I guess, to the both of you is, how do you think we can build more solutions together across data and digital rights and social justice groups, especially those who kind of do see their work still as being very separate from one another, right? And how can we establish and maintain more sustainable, equitable, flourishing cross-sector relationships that hopefully can give rise to the kind of work that you both have identified as really important and really needed? Maybe I can pass to Malika first this time, just to switch it up a little.
Okay, lots of suggestions here. I think, again, that idea of sort of subverting the burden of adaptation, not expecting that people outside of data and digital work will immediately adopt the same goals that we might have and immediately think that our priorities are theirs. Rather, I think if technologists are creative about how it is that we adapt our work towards being in solidarity with the movements we want to support, that's huge. And to that point, showing up for other people, not just sending them an email when you want them on a grant application, that is so important in building the kind of relationships that ultimately drive social movements and drive social justice. Another thing I will say, as someone working from No Tech for Tyrants, where we do unpaid volunteer work, is really being critical and careful with collaboration and safeguarding the people we collaborate with, and being really careful not to replicate extractive models of research work. And this is something I feel like I'm always learning from my co-organizers in No Tech for Tyrants about, just thinking of all the different ways that we should be questioning our own approach and our methodologies, and not assuming that other people's positions are necessarily the same as ours. So compensating people for their time, understanding that giving them a workshop isn't necessarily the great gift that we think it is sometimes, and not presuming that people need the tech things that we think they need, instead asking.
I think I'm up next, right? No, absolutely. I think for any collaboration to actually happen, and starting to bridge that gap, willingness to hear what the actual needs on the ground, especially when you're talking about grassroots organizations, it's like super important. It's really paramount. And one of the things that, specifically in the context of advocacy around digital ID, that it really kind of stood up for us in the research, is that really addressing the knowledge gap is super important. But you cannot do that with necessarily a workshop or just providing. It really needs to be about creating interdisciplinary, multilingual knowledge resources that are understandable, that are legible, and that are relevant, they're context relevant about digital ID, right? And they really need to be accessible by this diverse set of civil society actors. And besides that, just creating the space for people to meet. One of the main things that we heard over and over again on the research was just people saying, this is the first time that I'm being asked about, digital ID or, this identification system. I would like more spaces to be talking about this. I would like to be able to collaborate with other actors. So it really is about facilitating the establishment of spaces for diverse civil society actors to come and collaborate on digital ID issues. And we have like good examples of that on how you can facilitate this type of collaboration. And international organizations, funders have a pretty important role there. I want to cite just the example of in Uganda, the most recent research that came out. It was a collaboration between an Unwanted Witness, which is, kind of a DDR more focused group, and ISER, which is a group that is focused on socioeconomic rights, them coming together and doing a pretty comprehensive research project on the impacts of what digital ID rollout meant in Uganda, was the interdisciplinary character of it. It was you can see like how powerful the research, it makes much more powerful research there. So and that was facilitated by also an international organization. So there's so much space there to start bridging that gap and bringing groups together, and we really should be taking that as an opportunity.
So last question before before we wrap up this segment. Funders are very interested in this increasingly, and there's obviously a lot of conversation to be had about the role of funders, how they do funding, right, and the ways that they can contribute both to positively shaping, but also to potentially negatively reinforcing certain kinds of power dynamics and practices and so on. So my last question to both of you is, what can funders do to support this type of work, if anything? Like, what do you think is the appropriate way for them to get involved, and what sort of role should they play in this conversation as it moves forward? And whoever wants to go first, dealer's choice. Is that dealer's choice? I don't think that's the correct use of that term, but never mind.
I can jump in really quick just because I don't have a ton to say on this question, but I think creating more broad parameters for funding use and the types of organizations that can apply for funding is always something that's more useful, so that the funds aren't quite so constrained to organizations that already fit within the parameters that of the work that they already know is happening. That's quite basic, but I do think it's important.
That actually resonates a lot with what I was going to say, Malika. So that's good that you did the little plug. I mean, I'm going to also draw from and plug another research paper another research project that we had last year, which was exactly looking at how to fund more equitable and just tech and human rights space. We call it internally equity in funding, and the report is available for you to check it out. But essentially a prevailing trend throughout the research that we identified was kind of the notion that securing funding today, especially when you're talking about tech and human rights, is really overly depending on having prior access to specific networks, organizations, and people. So really about having the connections. So a big part of, realizing and having breaking this kind of siloed space and realizing a more equitable ecosystem is really about dismantling the existing barriers that contribute to the closeness in the first place, and really fostering kind of structures rooted in equity. Essentially, our research looked at how funders can address inequity within their funding structures, looking at feminist funding models and participatory grant making. I invite you all to look more into those terms, and really by shifting decision-making, power from funders to movements, communities, and organizations themselves. So I feel like this is also ways in which funders can be looking at, alternative ways to support organizations.
Thank you both so much. I think I'll hand back to Barbara to help facilitate questions that anyone attending might have for our two speakers.
Sure. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to come off mute and ask Teresa and Malika questions or make any comments about the topics that they discussed, the floor is yours. Alternatively, I can jump ahead to the next session of next part of our agenda, and share a bit more about our research project and our research findings. Let me just prepare the presentation, and then I can walk you through some of our research findings and what we've seen. So essentially, we have a report. Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. So we, since January, have been working on a research project across 4 different regions. So we're looking at the United States, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Western Europe. And we're trying to understand how to create more meaningful ties between social justice communities and digital rights communities. Just a second. And we did a combination of desk research, community calls, which are calls that we organize and gather folks from, development practitioners, human rights activists, academics, and people who are working in these spaces. And we did over 50 in-depth interviews with actors and activists, funders from all of those regions. We are trying to uncover, what are the gaps that exist between those communities, and what can be done to try and bridge more avenues for collaboration, and trying to understand what does intersectional collaboration across these spaces could look like. And we found a few different things. So our full report is coming out in November, and You can find it on our website soon, but some of our main findings are listed here. The first is that digital inequities have really deepened during the pandemic, and I know that this is not a surprise for anyone. We found that the digital divide has only widened in many places, and this was especially true for activists and organizations that we interviewed in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. The second big finding for us was how much of a digital emergency social justice activists are facing. So through our research, but also through our day-to-day work supporting organizations with tech and data, we found that the transition to a remote work and also the process of having to shift their entire work to a remote setting has really affected civil society. Not only the workflows, but also it has influenced how organizations and activists are able to reach the communities that they work with or not. So in Latin America, for instance, our interviewees shared challenges around connectivity, accessibility in remote settings, and how that changes how their work is done. We also heard how this new context was really an obstacle to the selection of context relevant and justice-based tech tools. So when working with technology, a lot of organizations during the pandemic have had to make really fast decisions in terms of what tech to use and how to apply it. So we've heard from social justice practitioners who had to resort to tools that they didn't really feel like were the safest options, or tools or apps that they didn't really feel were privacy respecting, but those were the tools that were most available, most commonly used, the easiest option or the feasible option for certain communities, and how that presents an obstacle. We also heard a lot about the lack of resources for implementing responsible data practices or digital security protocols, and how that makes it difficult for social justice organizations who might see how important it is to have the responsible data strategy or a digital security policy, but they struggle to make it a priority because everything just happens so fast. And then the final finding, which I think we discussed greatly during this call today, is the need for more collaboration and more intersectional approaches to data and digital rights issues. So one of our most consistent findings was that there's a perception that tech and data and digital rights issues are an field or an area that needs to evolve. It used to be thought of as a niche, but is increasingly touching every facet of life, including social justice activism. So we found that taking social justice into account and collaborating across those communities is really important, because oftentimes those communities, who are struggling for social justice are the ones who are being most impacted by the data and tech issues that have emerged during the pandemic. There's a general feeling, like I think Kito mentioned during this call, that cross-sector collaborations are still low, but there's a lot of appetite for more, and we're really looking forward to figuring out how we can foster a more collaborative environment. But I would love, here, but yeah, these are some of the things that we identified that would make intersectional approaches to data and digital rights. So we found that an intersectional approach to data and digital rights would recognize that some people are more impacted by tech and data issues. It would allow digital rights advocacy and data advocacy to be more informed by the realities of social justice communities. And I think something that we discussed quite a lot today is that looking at those issues from the perspective of social justice organizations would allow us to really look at those issues and how they actually play out, and not just how they theoretically affect our rights in our lives. Yeah, I think this wraps it up. I would love to know if you have questions, if you have thoughts on this. We would love to have a conversation with you all.
Well, if nobody has a question, I do to Malika. Malika, I was wondering by any chance if Tech for Tyrants is looking at vendors or, tech, especially, biometric data collection tech that is being sold both to, governments and to border patrol types of arrangements, just because we feel what we kind of found is that there's a lot of kind of secrecy around, who those vendors are, who is, the companies that are providing this type of tech to governments and, integrating the arrangements of digital ID. And it would be super helpful, I think, to understand better, those vendor structures, who are those actors.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the most direct answer is yes, a little bit. Broadly, our remit is starting to expand more into thinking about how technology and migration governance interact in general in the UK, specifically through the lens of the university, but also in other little iterations throughout, especially public sector contracts with private tech companies. So for instance, last summer, we ran a campaign called No Tech for You that Keto was actually a part of as well, where we highlighted the role of different secretive tech companies, often like really evil private companies that just inexplicably had these huge contracts with the government to run everything from the e-gates that we, check in and out of the airport with, to the systems that, process asylum applications. And it is quite alarming. For me, at least, I wasn't quite familiar with the tech space until maybe like 2 or 3 years ago. And so just seeing the pervasiveness of those connections was quite alarming. And incidentally, I think one of the ways that I think the abstractness of the work that we were talking about as a challenge is made quite real, because when you talk to someone and say, like, tech and migration governance can be a little out there, but when you say, oh yeah, the e-gate that you used to get through the country, that is actually implicated in this broader system, and here's why that is an issue. It is quite concrete. I'd be keen to hear how that plays into the questions related to digital ID in particular, though. Do you see that there's sort of a confluence between the digital ID systems you were looking at and then like migration governance in particular?
I'd say so, just because one of the trends that we're kind of identifying at this point is that these systems are being actively weaponized by states to, kind of exclude sections of the population that they are not, that they want to exclude, basically. So kind of adversarial uses of identifications. So what we saw that in Pakistan happening, like, just the active cancellation of identity cards for what they deem are Afghan refugees, and they are not. They're like Pakistani nationals at this point, but they try to deploy the systems against them exactly to exclude the sections of the population. And what we're seeing also, I think, I want to say Kenya and other places as well, is that refugees and migrants that are registered in UNHCR databases, for instance, when they're a child, right? They entered the country as a child, they are registered there. What national governments are doing, they're cross-referencing databases for when the person tries to apply for, a national ID card, for them to be like, oh, you're registered in a refugee database, therefore you're not a citizen, you're not entitled, you cannot have access to an ID card, even if the person, and we can discuss a lot about, migrants, refugees, and what those identities actually mean, and how the state, conveniently invisibilizes and or makes them visible. But so it actually has material, pretty clear implications on the lives of these people who are trying to, just, build a life, or just came into adulthood and are trying to get an ID card to access services. So, but again, yeah, the vendor space on this is still very much, kind of muddy and foggy. there isn't much information out there, and they would be, I would say, like a huge target for advocacy, advocacy efforts, internationally speaking, if we would know who are these actors and how they are, mobilizing these contracts.
I'd love to jump in here actually with a question for our attendees, flipping the script a little bit. I would love to know, obviously we shared a lot about our research and Malika shared about no text work. We'd love to know what you folks are working on, if you want to share with everybody else, like what your research focus is or the kinds of issues that you care about. And also maybe in the context of your work or more broadly, if some of the findings that we shared about the Intersectional Data and Digital Rights Project, if they resonate with folks, if you found similar themes in your work, if you've experienced it personally, yeah, we'd love to hear more if you feel comfortable. Also feel free to share thoughts in the chat if you would rather communicate with us that way. But yeah.
Hi, ladies. Thank you so much for sharing. It's a very interesting and very needed topic for us to be considering. I work with a local community organization group, and we've noticed over the past year just that increasing digital inequity, I think, is what all three of you kind of touched on in different areas. In our city, we've noticed it mostly around multilingual resources not being available. But then also just initial access to internet. People had alternate sources of getting online resources, but then it wasn't integrated with what they needed in the community. So I guess I was just curious from a more global perspective and what you all have been working on, what does that digital inequity really look like? And how has it been increasing this past year? Has it mostly been just people needing straight out access to internet online resources, or has it been more of that integration between systems that people are already using and that excluding people, or kind of just the social, it's not in the right language? So I was curious your thoughts on that.
I think we've seen, so this recent research spans out across quite different regions. And I think in each of the regions, we are seeing this play out in different ways. So for the folks we interviewed in Sub-Saharan Africa, it can be an issue of connectivity, of lack of access to justice, for instance, or lack of access to resources and devices in some places. In Latin America, that has also been the case. And then for folks we interviewed in Western Europe and in the US, it's also quite broad and quite diverse. So I think there's a bit of all of those issues appearing. So access, which oftentimes in the data and digital rights discussion can be seen as something that's not a priority anymore. Our research has shown that it's still very much a priority, and a lot of people still don't have access, and access is still an issue that is very much at the forefront of the discussions around digital inequities. I hope that clarified a little bit. Kito, I don't know if you want to jump in, if you have anything more to add.
I mean, I think that really covers most of it. I guess the difficulty is that there's so many existing digital inequities that, like in our research, you really see how the pandemic amplifies certain aspects of them, and it makes it really difficult to have a coordinated approach, right? Like especially during the pandemic, we were so reliant on technologies to, I mean, like in the case of digital ID, right, to give people access to social benefits, in terms of education, right, to allow children to learn remotely or people to conduct their jobs remotely where it's possible. So there's a kind of ways in which there's a massive digital huge digital inequities already, and then the ways in which the pandemic kind of overlays with that, I think, is something that we saw very keenly in, and it creates like new kinds of forms of digital inequities. We saw that a lot in our research. But I also want to leave space for Teresa or Malika to jump in if they have anything to say. Thanks again, Kit, for your question.
Well, if no one else wants to jump in, don't mind if I do. And thank you all for the wonderful exploration of this space. I must admit to being a newcomer. My name is Zach and McKinney, and I chair an IEEE standardization group developing a scientific reporting standard for neural interface research. And essentially, we're seeking to improve both the transparency and the rigor of all neuroscience and neurotechnology research. And as part of that effort, I'm really trying to build out the human aspects of what needs to be reported in the research in order to capture all of the user-centered, the human considerations that are often ignored, but that are actually essential to the risks, the benefits, and the well-being of the people who are ultimately intended to use this technology. So I'm just thrilled to hear where the conversation is and to hear that there's a greater room for collaboration. That's very much our group's spirit. And I'll throw a link in the chat for anyone who wants to learn more, but I'm happy to otherwise keep quiet and leave the space for those who have obviously done much greater work than I have in expanding the horizon of possibility and awareness here. So thank you all again.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Zach. Yeah, if you can drop a link, that sounds super interesting. And I'd like to extend the invitation for others on the call. If you want to share or drop a link about your work, we'd be happy to reach out. I don't know if anyone else has any comments or questions. If not, I think we can wrap this up. It was really great sharing some of our work with you. Thanks again, Malika and Teresa, for presenting and sharing a bit about what you do. I'm gonna leave our website here for anyone who might want to know more about our work or reach out. Thank you so much for joining. Thanks, Zach and Kit, for sharing. And yeah, we would be happy to chat with you all if you want to reach out. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.